new journal and guide. Subscribe today.
I know the Robert Bobb Group was recently hired by the Richmond Chamber of Commerce to take a look at cost-cutting measures in Richmond to bridge a $23 million budget gap between the administration and schools. So one of the things Merrick mentioned early on was how do you reposition local government to address issues of this nature? Can you talk a bit about education and some of those strategies to help us reposition?
Well, I think what the mayor talked about in terms of the local level, when you start looking at what happened in, for instance, what we looked at in Detroit when we were there to restructure that school system, I mean, you could see what was happening. Here's a city that had at one point 1.8 million people and 200,000 children. And therefore, for 150 square miles, now that same 150 square miles has 600,000 people, and it has a public school system that has 69,000. The tax base is eroded. I mean, you can, but that's what has happened. You have a school system that is been, I guess, it has been challenged by the whole advent of charter schools. And when you start looking at per pupil allocation, it becomes this, you can't sustain the model. You really can't. You can't sustain transportation. You can't sustain any of it. So what had to happen was we focused on just the core business. And that was the core business of education. And we had to do some things like managed competition rather, for anything that was outside of the scholastic, because you could not sustain that model. They had a legacy deficit. For example, we outsourced transportation. But we also insisted that in the outsourcing that they would hire local minority participation. So we had local bus drivers. We created more jobs. We were able to do those things, but it's a different kind of thought process. For example, you have to look at teachers and instruction and say, all right, if the mayor is the best biology teacher in the system, why don't you use technology and allow him to teach everybody in that system as opposed to being in one school? We had to really restructure how we looked about the business of education. And when you look at the current model, the things that we had to use to transform it, it was not easy. It's a huge paradigm shift. I mean, when you start looking at having managed competition for facilities, talking about shared services between the municipality and the education, the school board. So these are all of the things where before you would come in and they say, all right, let's cut teachers across the board, or let's cut, just do across the board cut. This was really a re-engineering and restructuring. And it also meant that you had to have a different skill set. When we were talking to Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia suggested that they wanted to move to a decentralized school system, and they'd like to have that right on the system the following year. Well, it takes a very different mindset for a principal who is academically trained to now become the CEO of their building. You just don't drop that on it. There's a training, there's instruction. So when you start looking at these things, you're looking at really not cutting around the edges. You're really talking about re-engineering and restructuring. I said this when we went into Detroit. If this was a corporation, you would have stripped it of its assets, repositioned it, and so these are children. They're students. They are. I mean, this is. You look at changing curriculum. We said, look, you can't start training these children for jobs that don't exist from the beginning. So you've got to look at. That's why we looked at putting in and did STEM schools. I mean, because that's the way they're going to compete globally. If they're out there trained in anything other than that, we're going to have some problems. Our children will not be able to compete. We see the same thing in local government. And let me say something, and I think that's really important, and the mayor touched on it. The federal government cannot continue to cut, and then suggest that mayors such as myself have to figure out, because now they become magicians. They have cut, they have done the things. If you look at what is happening with HUD right now, federal government, I sit on the board of the City of Alexandria, Virginia Housing Authority. And what we have done is we have moved to a private sector model because HUD is literally taking the funding and retrenching so much that we're in a position that we now no longer can look at our portfolio of property and not strategically think, how do we leverage those assets to be able to create more affordability, to create more affordable housing opportunities. So, in other words, we've got prime property, and for a while we were building townhouses. We need to be building vertically where our transit-oriented development is so that we can create more FAR for affordability. But what HUD is gradually saying is we're getting out of that business. And they can't leave mayors and things out here like this because there are only so many rabbits they can pull out of the hat. There are only so many things they can do. There are only so many cuts they can make. There's only so much re-engineering and restructuring that they can do before the rubber meets the road.
I completely identify with what America's saying, and I think that having a consultant come in with a fresh perspective is a good thing. As I look at our government, I think we have to have that same approach, and I think we really have to believe in each other, that there's a good faith effort on both parts to find some common ground.
This production has been brought to you by Image Entertainment.